started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started with the Pledge of Allegiance, if we want to all rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Before we really kind of take note that longtime board member Bobby Watkins passed away on September 25th. Bobby was a member for many years, was a Civil War scholar in his own right, and was a trailblazer for civil rights in actions, words, and accomplishments. He was also a noted football player, many of you know, at The Ohio State University and professionally for the Chicago Bears. So I just want to extend our thoughts and prayers to Bobby's family, to his wife Willis, and all of his family members. So if we could just take a moment of silence to remember Bobby. Thank you.
Mark?
Yes?
I just want to indicate that I had an opportunity to attend his memorial service, and the family had gently over his casket his home jersey, Chicago Bears, number 45, with the orange stripe. His family had always wore number 45 in high school, Ohio State, Chicago Bears, Chicago Cardinals. 45 was his number, and he had a gently draped over his casket. It was very nice.
Thank you, Peter. And in Bobby's memory, the Roundtable did make a $100 donation on behalf of the Roundtable in his memory to the Alzheimer's Association in his memory. Some business before we really jump into tonight's conversation. There are new polo shirts available. Very nicely done. Don Brown deserves a round of applause for all of his work. Don created the new logo and really kind of took the lead on making this happen. So if you're interested in purchasing your own Roundtable polo, see Don and he'll be able to work out the details with you after the meeting. Thank you again. The holiday dinner is coming up December 6th at 6 p.m. at the Century House again. It was great last year there at the Century House. So we hope you'll be able to join us. Make sure you purchase your tickets in advance. Tonight we pulled an audible. Our original speaker, Kevin Levin, was supposed to talk about Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and his action and his duty before becoming a member of the 54th Massachusetts. Unfortunately, Kevin had a family emergency and could not join us tonight. But our November speaker, a longtime friend of this roundtable, who has spoken to this roundtable many times, was supposed to be our November speaker, Mark Dunkelman, stepped up and is going to pinch hit tonight and offer his presentation tonight in October rather than in November. So a special thanks to Mark for filling in for Kevin tonight. We much appreciate it. Mark is a noted historian and longtime friend of our roundtable. His research has focused on the hard-fighting 154th New York Regiment. Mark's great-grandfather was a member of that regiment. He has contacted over 1,200 descendants of the hardtack regiment, as they were known as, locating and copying over 1,700 wartime letters, 250 portraits, 25 diaries, dozens of relics, and several other memoirs and accounts. He is the author of Gettysburg's Unknown Soldier, a work about Amos Humiston of the 154th New York and his story at Gettysburg, a biography of Patrick Henry Jones, Gettysburg's Coster Avenue, which Mark did a lot of work with the creation of the beautiful mural that is there on Coster Avenue in Gettysburg, and a book known as The Hardtack Regiment, titled The Hardtack Regiment. His presentation today will cover the many stories of his adventures as a Civil War author and historian. So a special thank you to Mark and a warm welcome.
Okay, thank you, Mark. My cousin Mark. I call anybody named Mark my cousin. So tonight, can we couple lights a little bit? the class artist. And so art was what I wanted to do, what I figured I had to do. But at the same time, I had a couple of other competing interests, playing music, about which I won't say anything more, and Civil War history. So here I am in 1961, 13, 14 years old. Picture one of my horses and Civil War generals there. General William Tecumseh Sherman, James Birdseye McPherson, George Thomas Sherman, John Schofield, and Blackjack Logan. So I was into it. And the reason I got into it was because of stories I heard from my father about his grandfather. And my dad grew up on a farm in Cattaraugus County, New York, south of Buffalo, where I was growing up, with his parents, his younger sister, and his maternal grandfather, the Civil War veteran, John Longhans. And my dad told me these stories of John Longhans marching with Sherman to the sea. And as my father related these stories to me, I could just picture myself by his side down in Georgia. And at one point, my dad brought home an old reel-to-reel tape recorder from the office, from his office. And decades before I ever heard the term oral history, something compelled me to sit my father down and interview him, and then transcribe my interview with him. And so now I've got these 4 or 5 sheets of lined notebook paper with my typewriting on it that have preserved verbatim these stories that were such an inspiration to me. And in addition to the stories were relics that my family had preserved. And here we have John Longhans's, some of John's materials, including ribbons he wore at regimental and GAR reunions, the buttons from his Grand Army of the Republic uniform coat, a hardtack, some photographs of Memorial Day ceremonies in Ellicottville, New York, the little community that he lived in, little town. And seeing these things really just solidified the interest for me, because here I was handling these things that were approaching 100 years of age. So I'm getting interested in this in the late 50s. You know, I turned 10 in 1957. Now, my interest soon extended beyond that of just my great-grandfather personally to his regiment as a whole. I was just curious, what did this regiment do? Now, my great-grandfather enlisted late in the war. He enlisted in September of '64, joined the 154th New York at Atlanta, and made the marches with Sherman to Savannah and up through the Carolinas. So he was in at the tail end of the war. I wanted to find out what was going on with the 154th New York Volunteer Infantry before he joined, and during the period he was a member of the regiment. Now, I happen to be a baseball fan. Yeah, my hero, Edwin Donald Duke Snyder of the Brooklyn Dodgers. It just so happened that my wife-to-be and I were on the road in the fall of 1970. And it was my birthday, which incidentally is coming up in 4 days. October 29, 1970. We're coming back from a visit to her brother, who was a student at Ithaca College, coming back to Providence. And we passed through Cooperstown. And I said, I want to go to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And we got to the Hall of Fame, and the admission fee was something like $3.25. And we needed the cash for gas to get back to Rhode Island. So I said, okay, we got to pass. We got to pass on this. And we drove a little farther down the road, and there was a building with a sign out front saying it was the New York Historical Association. And I immediately just pulled into the parking lot. And I went in this place, and I checked the card catalog, as I had, by this time, a want to do. And lo and behold, I discovered a master's thesis. The Hardtack Regiment, History of the 154th Infantry, New York State Volunteer Infantry, 154th Regiment, New York State Volunteer Infantry, written by a guy named Michael J. Winey, just a few years before, 1967. Now, I thought I was the only person in the world interested in this particular regiment. But here, on my birthday, I discovered that here's a professionally trained historian who has studied the regiment and written about it. And I took a very quick look through Mike's thesis, and I discovered he had located sources that were new to me. But likewise, I had located sources that were new to Mike. So I said, I got to get a hold of this guy, because it only makes sense for us to work together. And so I wrote Mike a letter. And fortunately for me, one of the faculty there knew where he was. And at the time he was with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission in Harrisburg. So we met. And we agreed to collaborate. And in 1973, come on, there we go. I made the first of what have become annual trips back to Western New York to try to hunt up material for a regimental history. And I learned it pays to advertise. I planted stories like this one in the Olean Times-Herald, the Jamestown Post-Journal, the Salamanca Republican Press. And within days after the first story appearing, I received a letter from a woman, Peggy Whitcomb, who told me, our great uncle, Harvey Earl, served in the 154th New York, and we have 19 of his wartime letters. But they end just before Gettysburg, and we don't know what happened to him. And I was able to tell Peggy Whitcomb, your granduncle was captured at the Battle of Gettysburg and died as a prisoner of war at Andersonville Prison in Georgia. Here's his grave number. And that's what got it started. And I kept hearing from people. And it became, like I say, an annual thing. So the first trip was in 73, and then Mike and I got together after a point, after we thought that we had collected enough material, and I started writing letters to publishers. Wait a second, we jumped. Okay, yeah. So, I'm sorry. In 1981, finally, our book was published. I still have the stack of reject letters I got from publishers, not that thing. But we finally linked up with Associated University Presses, Fairleigh Dickinson University Press. You know, I told a friend of mine, my book's been accepted by Fairleigh Dickinson University Press, and he was from New Jersey. He said, we call it fairly ridiculous. Little wind out of my sails, but what are you going to do? So I had made a vow that I was going to publish a regimental history of the 154th before I turned 50 years old. But because of the good fortune of meeting Mike Winey, which spurred me to serious research, I was able to do it by the time I was 34 years old. So I beat and this was all I wanted to do with Civil War history. Now, what is the history of the 154th New York? Raised in the summer of 1862 in response to Lincoln's call for 300,000 three-year volunteers. Assigned to the Army of the Potomac, 11th Army Corps. First battle, Chancellorsville. 11th Corps at Chancellorsville gets clobbered by Stonewall Jackson, overrun by Stonewall Jackson. Famous surprise flank attack on the night of May 2nd, 1863. And the 154th New York was part of the Bushbeck Line, the last organized resistance to Jackson's onslaught by the 11th Army Corps. And in doing that, they lost 40% casualties, 240 out of 590 men. That was the fourth highest regimental loss rate in the entire Army of the Potomac. 2 months later at Gettysburg, they lost 78%. attempting again to cover the retreat of the 11th Army Corps on the first day of the battle in the little-known battle at Coons Brickyard in what was then the outskirts of the town and has since been swallowed up. Then, in response to the Battle of Chickamauga, the 11th and 12th Corps were transferred to the Western Theater, and the 154th went with them, participated in the opening of the Cracker Line that relieved the siege of Chattanooga, minimally engaged in the Battle of Chattanooga, the march to Knoxville to relieve Burnside's forces there, very tough march. Winter Camp, Lookout Valley, Tennessee, and then Sherman takes over the Western Theater, and the 154th is now part of the 20th Army Corps, formed by the merger of the 11th and 12th, took part in the Atlanta campaign, and in a string of battles lost approximately 50% again of their force. So they were a fighting regiment. Then my great-grandfather joined them in Atlanta, and they made the marches with Sherman to Savannah and back up to Raleigh. Okay, I guess I got to point that down. So here's the author's blurbs on the back of the book. I'm the one on the left, incidentally. I like to point that out. And you'll notice and I wrote this, Mr. Dunkelman is planning a mural in Gettysburg adjacent to Coster Avenue, site of the 154th monument, depicting the fighting that occurred there. May I offer you some advice? If you ever have a grandiose idea, don't put it in print, because then you feel compelled to go ahead and do it, right? And eventually I did paint that mural. It went up in 1988, 7 years after this book was published. So Mike Winey, there it is. Here we are outside the Seneca Theater in Salamanca, New York. Salamanca, incidentally, is the largest city on indigenous people land in the United States of America. And we held one of our reunions there this particular year. This was August 2010 for the 25th annual reunion. Mike died in January of 2012. It's been 10 years. And I've continued the work solo. And as Mark indicated, I've had the good fortune to connect with more than 1,300 descendants and amass this tremendous body of material on the 154th New York and turn it into 6 full-length books and dozens of articles. I consider the 154th New York the lens through which I examine Civil War history, and it was a body of 1,000 men, but it soon shattered into all sorts of different directions. You had these guys winding up all over the place as a result of disease, desertions, deaths. So there's a gazillion stories to be told. And what I'm going to tell you about this evening are some of the occurrences in these decades of work I've put into studying the 154th New York that seem magical, if not divinely ordained, which frankly I think my birthday surprise of encountering Mike Winey's thesis fits into. You know, General William Tecumseh Sherman wrote to his wife from Savannah after his army reached Savannah after the March of the Sea. I can hardly realize it, for really it was easy, but like one who has walked a narrow plank, I look back and wonder if I really did it. And that's the way I kind of feel about this work that I've done. So, the second, fourth year going to Cattaraugus County, New York, where 8 of the 10 companies were raised. Cattaraugus County is about 50 miles south of Buffalo. It's right on the Pennsylvania border. It and neighboring Chautauqua counties was where the 154th came from. 8 companies, Cattaraugus, 2 from Chautauqua. So here we are at the home of Kitty Reeler. That's her sitting on the porch with her daughter Margaret Warren in Allegheny, New York. Kitty was one of 3 children of Civil War soldiers that I had the good fortune to connect with back in the 70s. Obviously, her father was, an older man when Kitty was born. She was in her 90s when I met her here. And Kitty had, amongst other things, a couple of tintypes of her dad, Private Ashbel Bozard, and his diary. And we copied these. My wife was a photographer. She copied the tintypes. And we were getting ready to leave, and Kitty says, "Wait 1 minute, there's something else I want to show you." And she, at age 90, climbed the stairs to her attic and came down bearing this. And this is a photograph of 16 members of the 154th New York Volunteers at their monument in Gettysburg. Now, I had seen pictures of the monument, but I had never seen a picture before of veterans at the monument. So this was tremendously exciting to me, and it got even more exciting. Whoops. Sorry, I'm having problems with this clicker. There we go. Got even more exciting when Kitty pointed to the fellow in the light-colored hat and said, "That's my father." And I pointed to the guy next to him in the GAR hat and said, "That's my great-grandfather." Now, I'll make a confession. Since then, I've discovered lots of photos of the veterans of the 154th New York at various reunions and gatherings. And my great-grandfather has a doppelganger. And I'm wondering if this might not be him. I'm really not sure if it is my great-grandfather. But in any case, this marvelous photograph was a real exciting find. And we popped it out of its frame and took pictures of it. And of course, it appeared in the hardtack regiment. So that was one adventure for sure. And incidentally, the picture now hangs in my office because Kitty passed away and her daughter remembered me and my interest. And she was about to leave Western New York for retirement in Florida, and she said, "I want you to have this picture." So it's a very, very moving thing for me to have. So when the Hardtack Regiment was published, I wanted to publicize it a little bit in Cattaraugus County. And this is a photograph from an article that was published in the Salamanca paper as a result. So my aunt Florence Dunkelman Sarver, my wife Annette, and my sister Amy and I got in the car to drive down to Cattaraugus County from Buffalo for me to meet with the people at the newspaper. And we decided to stop at the family farm on the way down there. And here it is, on its little hillside, Jackman Hill, Ellicottville, New York. And the family that had purchased this farm from my family in 1931 was still there. This is 50 years later, 1981. And I said to the gentleman, Leonard Aldro, "You know, my dad always said that his grandfather's musket was around the place when he was a kid." And Leonard said to me, "Well, I've never seen a musket here, but come here, I want to show you something." And he took me out to the horse barn, which is the smaller barn here. This is the cow barn. And we go in this place and it's full of stuff. A lot of farm machinery, all sorts of stuff, junk, a lot of junk. And he said, "When I bought this place from your family, everything they left behind I just threw in here." And then he walked over to a corner and he rummaged around for a while, and he came out and he was holding an Enfield rifled musket bayonet that was there from when my family left. So whose bayonet could it be? Nobody but my great-grandfather's. It was his bayonet. Well, I made a little deal with Leonard Aldro. He was going to give it to me. I forget, I think I gave him like maybe the $3.25 that I didn't have to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Anyway, I got the bayonet, and Leonard told me this. There's a leather box around here somewhere too. I don't know where it is right now. Well, we couldn't wait around and dive into this stuff because I was going to get interviewed with the newspaper. So we had to leave it. And I'm thinking all the time, leather box, cartridge box, cap pouch. Well, the next time we went back down to the farm, the Aldros were gone and that horse barn was cleaned out. So if my great-grandfather's cartridge box was part of that stuff, it is no longer with us, I would imagine. When we held the first gathering of descendants of the 154th New York, I couldn't call it a reunion because we hadn't met before. In Little Otto, New York, one of the descendants brought his ancestors' Enfield rifled musket with him. And I happened to have my great-grandfather's bayonet, so we attached A onto B, and I was able to pose for a photo. Here's the Enfield, and perhaps you can see faintly here the crescent and star, the badges of the 11th and 20th Army Corps, which he carved into the stock. And here's the soldier that carried it. Franklin Crick, Corporal, Company A, 154th. He missed Gettysburg because he was hospitalized at that time, but otherwise he was with the regiment through its entire service. So my next adventure concerns this fellow, Byron Alexander Johnston. He had prior service in the 37th New York, and before that, he had sort of an interesting experience. Most of the members of the 154th New York were farmers. They hadn't been out of Cattaraugus County, chances are, during their lifetimes. Byron Johnson had made a trip to California overland in the early 1850s and returned via the isthmus, in other words, by sea from California to Nicaragua or Panama or wherever they used to cross, and then overland to another steamer to come, and was involved in a shipwreck during that voyage. So he had some adventures. And he joined the 154th New York after the 37th time was up, and eventually he became, come on baby, a captain. Here he is as a captain, wearing the Silver Star badge of the 20th Army Corps. So, Mike Winey at one point got an email from a dentist in Florida who collects Civil War weapons, specializes in Confederate handguns. But he also had this Colt Navy revolver, model 1861, which he notified Mike about, and Mike notified me about. And the reason is of interest is because it belonged to Byron A. Johnston, 154th NYSV, engraved on the backstrap. Mike Winey knew a whole lot more than I did about the material culture of the Civil War. In other words, the stuff the guys wore, carried, etc. And Mike also followed the market, which I really didn't at this point. And Mike told me that the price the Florida dentist was asking for this revolver was too high. And so I took Mike's advice and I passed on purchasing it. Whereupon I proceeded to kick myself thereafter for letting a possibility like this go. Well, let's leave that one for a while. Let's look at this fellow here. Come on, baby. There. Mark Mello mentioned that I wrote a history of Patrick Henry Jones. The subtitle is Irish-American Civil War General and Gilded Age Politician. He was the longtime colonel of the 154th New York, became a brigadier general later in the war. Good-looking native Irishman. Well, surprise, surprise, Mike hears from the Florida dentist again. He's got another revolver identified to an officer of the 154th New York. This is a Colt police revolver, model 1862. That's a five shot, caliber 36. Oh, that's my book. I skipped over a slide. There it is. Again, engraved. P.H. Jones, 154th New York Volunteers. Well, this time, I'm sorry. I wasn't going to let this one go. And so I emptied my savings account to purchase it. Don't worry. A number of years later, Antiques Roadshow came to Providence, and I took this pistol down, and they told me it was worth 4 to 5 times what I paid for it. And I'm sure it's worth even more than that now, particularly since some guy went and wrote a book about this guy. Right? That's got to just raise the values. Jones is a fascinating guy. I haven't put together a presentation on him, but I call his story a rags to riches to rags story. He came from nothing. He attained tremendous prominence. He was one of the best known Irishmen of his day, Irish immigrants. And then he had this decline. And what I think was the straw was his involvement in one of the most sensational crimes of the 1870s. Let's just leave it at that for now. So when the Hardtack Regiment was published, you might have noticed on my author's photo that I was kneeling behind a headstone. Well, this is it. It's Patrick Henry Jones's grave on Staten Island, St. Peter's Cemetery, Port Richmond, Staten Island. I was already interested in him. I knew that there was a story behind him. So another take from that same photo session appeared on my first book, and then when the Jones biography came out back in 2014, I went back there, posed again by the headstone. Now, there's a coda to this entire story. A fellow I knew in Western New York was a big collector of Civil War memorabilia out there, particularly the Cattaraugus County. And he notified me once that he had purchased a pistol that had belonged to Byron Johnston. So he got the pistol that I had passed up on. And for years, I gently nudged him if he would be interested in selling his collection. And it finally happened, and now I own both pistols. So that adventure came out to my satisfaction. My next adventure involves this fellow, Phil Palin, a good friend of mine from Gowanda, New York, avid history guy. And I know you got a time constraint here. We're good. I just want to point out that we are standing on the steps of the Cattaraugus County Memorial and Historical Building in Little Valley, the county seat of Cattaraugus County. And the plaque above the entrance reads, "To the memory of its soldiers and sailors in the War of the Rebellion, this building is erected by Cattaraugus County." And at this time, ever since it was dedicated in 1914, it had housed the County Historical Museum. I spent a lot of time in that place, a lot of time. And then in the year 2004, Cattaraugus County chose to move the museum out of the Memorial and Historical Building where it was meant to remain forever and move it 23 miles to a town called Machias, New York. Now, a lot of the people that use the museum are there to do genealogical research. And when the museum was still in the home where it should have remained forever, they could just cross the street into the main county building and look in the county deed books to find out when Grandpa bought the farm. Now they got to drive 23 friggin' miles back to the county seat. The way it came about is kind of interesting too, in that the building that they moved the museum to is a historic structure. It used to be the county per farm. It's called the Stone House. It is built out of stone. They poured $1 million into it while they were letting the memorial and historical building deteriorate. And it just happened that the head of the board, when the move was made, was from the town of Machias. Well, I was crestfallen when they moved the museum out of there, but the worst came 9 years later in 2013 when Cattaraugus County decided to devote $125,000 in casino money to tear down the Civil War Memorial Building. And I instantly sent out an email to my hundreds of descendants that are on my mailing list, and they inundated the legislature with protests, and the plan eventually was put on hold, and a lot of stuff has happened since then. Eventually the county sold the building to a group that was formed called Citizens Advocating Memorial Preservation, and we just got started to save the place. Now we own the place, and we're trying to raise money to rehabilitate it. And it's been a long, long project, but it's one that I fervently believe in because it's a Civil War memorial. You don't tear them down. You don't tear them down. So wish me luck on that. And incidentally, check it out, www.cattcomemorial.org. That's 2 T's, C-A-T-T, co-memorial.org. This is taking up a lot of my time now, working with this group. So anyway, my friend Phil, good friend, Western New York, and I got an email from him once. And he said, Mark, I was just out in Ohio. Come on. No, I went way past here. Okay, this is where I want to be, I believe. Sorry about that. This is one of the relics, if you will, that was handed down to my family, and this is the newspaper, the Ellicottville Post, published after my great-grandfather died. And his obituary is on the front page. John Longhant, Civil War veteran, dies. Was corporal in Old 154th and marched with Schreeman to the sea. They spelled Sherman's name wrong in the headline. This is always, I've written about this. This man lived for 85 years. He was an immigrant from Germany. And here's his life encapsulated into the 9 months he spent as one of General Sherman's bombers. That made him an American. He was a very proud veteran for the rest of his life. So what does this have to do with my friend Phil Palin? Well, Phil notifies me that he happened to be in Ohio at some flea market antique show, and he came across a framed copy of my great-grandfather's obituary. And he knew it was him, and he bought it, $35. And he said, it's yours at cost. And I said, gee, Phil, it must have been a family member or a close family friend that would have gone to the trouble to frame Grandpa Longhant's obituary. He said, no. The woman had an antique frame, and she was looking for something old to put in it. And she just happened to have a copy of this very obscure weekly rural Western New York newspaper, and saw the picture, Civil War veteran, the little graphic by the word post. Oh, there's a picture of the Civil War veteran. This will look good in there. And so she cut it up and put it in the frame. What are the chances of all this happening? There's a reason why this is hanging on my wall now. It astonishes me. Just astonishes me. Here's another one, another adventure. I wrote an article for the Arlington Historical magazine. Where are we? 1994. The article was called Camp Seward on Arlington Heights, a Yankee Regiment's First Stop in Dixie. And that's exactly what it was about. The 154th was at full strength. They had just left home, Western New York. They're at their first camp in Virginia on the sacred soil. And of course, everybody's writing letters home. So I had this tremendous body of work to tell this story. And luckily for me, of the 10 days they spent in this camp, 10 days. Luckily for me, come on. Okay. Luckily for me, there was a picture of this camp. Mark, if you don't mind, the right-hand arrow. Thank you. This is kind of funny. I discovered this print in the Library of Congress, and William A. Frazanito happened to be working there at the same time. Bill Frazanito went to the same graduate program at Cooperstown that Mike Winey did. So I kind of know these guys. And when I pulled this out and I went, wow, look at this, Frazanito looked at me and said, "You haven't seen that before?" Like, what's the matter with you? What took you so long? But it was tremendously exciting. So when I published that article, a thought occurred to me. I wonder if you can do a search for an old print like this, like a used book dealer will do a search for you for a particular book you want. And we just happened to have a dealer in ephemera in our neighborhood in Providence who had bins and bins full of old Harper's Weekly stuff and, all sorts of stuff, postcards, paper, old paper. So I went and I asked him. It was a Saturday. I showed him the reproduction of the print and asked him, if he could keep his eye open for something like that. If you ever saw one that I want it. Okay, 2 days later on Monday, totally unrelated, I got a letter or an email, I can't remember exactly what. Next, please. Thank you, this is really good. From a antiques dealer out in California, notifying me that he had a Camp Seward print by Ellen Rosenthal of Philadelphia for sale. And of course I purchased it. Now, you'll notice it's ripped, it's foxed, it's stained, but this one is personalized as well. It was sent by a 15-year-old who had fibbed about his age to enlist, Private DeVilla Wheeler of Company I, to his father, William Wheeler, in Allegheny, New York. And on the front of it, DeVilla made these annotations. This is a position of our camp. This is Fort Richardson atop the hill. This is Company I. And next, please. DeVilla Wheeler to William H. Wheeler, right down along there. Now, before we go on about this, a word about these prints. The Rosenthal firm was from Philadelphia, and they did a whole series of these tinted engravings of the camps of Civil War regiments around Washington. I mentioned the 154th was only in this camp for 10 days. During that period of time, somebody came, did this sketch, either took it back to, I would imagine, took it back to Philadelphia where it was engraved, printed, and hurried back down to Northern Virginia to be sold to the soldiers. There's a whole series of these of different regiments. Mark, you've probably seen these things. They're really nicely done. They also did stationery. I've discovered a letter written on the stationery, and I just recently purchased, and I hadn't seen it before, a good-sized envelope with the same print on it. The Rosenthal camp prints are fascinating to me, and I'm so glad that they did one of the 154th in New York. So, next slide, please. Well, there's the DeVillo to William Wheeler. Next, Mark. And on the back, you can't really see this, but he wrote this on the back. Presented to William H. Wheeler, his father, by DeVillo. And then he wrote this, Old Allegheny is the place for me. This 15-year-old kid was homesick already. You know, he hadn't been away from home 2 weeks yet. Next, please. DeVillo was captured at Gettysburg, died as a prisoner of war at Richmond, Virginia. He's buried as an unknown in the Richmond National Cemetery. His grandnephew, Ed Havers of Olean, New York, on the left here, arranged for the Veterans Administration to provide a marker for DeVillo in his hometown Allegheny Cemetery. It was dedicated on June 30th, 2012. I was honored to deliver the main address in which I quoted from DeVillo's letters home. And of course, I had the Camp Seward print that he sent home with me. That's Ed and his wife Mary with me on that day. Incidentally, I mentioned DeVillo's letters. I found those in the pension file, in the Wheeler pension file. For somebody that studies a particular regiment like this is really invaluable knowledge. Soldiers who died, whose parents were dependent on them for income, the parents, in applying for a pension, frequently submitted letters their sons had sent to them mentioning sending money home, financial business, as proof, I guess, of their dependency, right? So I made a list of all the soldiers that died and then discovered which ones had independent, and I spent a couple different sessions down in Washington in the archives and pulled, I think, a couple hundred letters out of pension files written by these soldiers. And some of the other letters are equally fascinating because they're letters written by officers notifying the parents of the death of their son, etc. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff. Next slide. Years later, I obtained another one, another copy of this print, eBay, I guess. Old frame, but this one had been cut down. It had no identifying markings on it. So I actually traded this one away for some other 154th New York memorabilia. Okay, next slide. So I got a whole talk about my book, Gettysburg's Unknown Soldier, which is the story of Sergeant Amos Humiston. You all know his story. The soldier found dead at Gettysburg with the photograph of his 3 children in his hand, which proved to be the clue that led to the identity of him and his family and became a great cause celeb throughout the North. And I had a lot of adventures writing this book, which I tell in my talk on Gettysburg's Unknown Soldier. But I want to tell you about one particular one. Next slide. I got an email from this guy, Errol Morris, January 11th, 2009. I had heard of Errol Morris. I knew that The Fog of War, one of his films, had won Academy Award. I wrote him back and said, yeah, we can talk. And this led to a process of us having lots of conversations. And eventually, Errol writing a 5-part series for the online New York Times about the story of the Humiston family and how I came to write the story, which, as I said, entailed some interesting adventures, and then his thoughts about the story. Next slide, please. Eventually, that was, oh, here's The Fog of War, Robert McNamara. Excellent film if you've never seen it. This caused quite a stir because, in essence, it was McNamara's mea culpa about Vietnam. Next slide, yeah, sorry, Mark. This is how Errol learned about my book. It was referred to by Drew Gilpin's Faust in her much more better known book, This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War. Next one. So the Humiston chapter is the last one in Errol's book, Believing is Seeing. Observations on the Mystery of Photography, the final chapter, Whose Father Is He? So, next slide. So I'm friends with this Oscar-winning documentary filmmaker. And this Oscar-winning documentary filmmaker buys the film rights to my book. So I'm really totally excited. A Humiston movie is going to be made. Of all the stories that emerged from the 154th New York, this is the most ready for cinematic treatment. That's for darn sure. It's such a melodramatic story. Well, unfortunately, it was a 5-year renewable option, and he never picked up the option. Next. But when the book did come out in paperback, Errol very kindly wrote a foreword to it, which is nice. And I think he's still thinking about a Humiston film. Because once Errol Morris gets latched onto a subject, he doesn't let go. He's a pit bull. And as I said, this is a very cinematic story, the Humiston story. I've said this a gazillion times. I know exactly what kind of a film Ken Burns would make about the Humiston story. It would be a beautiful film. It would be exquisitely made. It'd be very sentimental. It'd be touching. I don't know what kind of a movie Errol Morris would make about the Humiston story, and that excites me. So I'm still holding up hope. I'd advise you, I'd request, I'd beg you, write to Errol Morris. He's easy to track down. He's got a website. And say, make that movie about Amos Humiston. Maybe that'll prod him. Next slide. Some of you might have seen this. Gettysburg, it was on History Channel. Let's see if I got the date here. Yeah, 2011. And Tony Scott and Ridley Scott, these are famous Hollywood people, put together this look at the Battle of Gettysburg, and they used 8 soldiers from North and South to tell the story of the battle. And Amos Humiston was one of them. And they used some quotes from my book, but they only just scratched the surface of this story. And so a Humiston film has yet to be made. So Errol Morris, come on, let's get going. Okay, I think this is the last adventure I'm going to speak to you about. And Mark, the next slide. Well, actually, the second to last, the penultimate. This again was on the slide of the family relics. Now, we thought that this was just really cool, our family, because these were cotton balls Grandpa Longhans picked during Sherman's March to the Sea. This is our family legend. And you'll notice he was a German immigrant. He obviously had never seen cotton growing before. He picked one ball that had yet to open, one partially open, one fully open. And so we thought this was a remarkable relic of the Civil War and our family. But we never talked about the box. And the cotton balls had always been in the box. And I became curious about the box. The box is very feminine. It's got a picture of a woman on the lid. It's got a mirror inside the lid with gold bric-a-brac around it. It's got fancy paper all around it. It's got sort of a velvety bottom to it. At one point I learned that there was a box expert at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So I wrote to him and sent him a picture of the box and asked him what he could tell me about it. And he said, I can tell you that it's papier-mâché, American-made, 1850s, probably. All of which jibes with our family story. So the question to me is, okay, we know the cotton balls came from a field somewhere. Where did the box come from? A dresser in Georgia? A bureau in South Carolina? Next book. So partially inspired by that, I decided I had to write a book about the Sherman marches because of my great-grandfather's involvement. And one of my goals in writing this book was to collect the Southern equivalents of my family stories and relics. So that's what I was looking for. Stories along this very specific route. Next, please. And here's one of the maps from the book. This is the second phase of the march from Milledgeville, which of course was the Georgia state capital during the Civil War, down to Savannah. And you'll look, and right near Sandersville, there's a place called Forest Grove, Wortham. Nice try. And I stopped there during my research trip in 2007, I guess it was. Yeah, 2007. I spent 6 weeks following the route from Atlanta to Savannah, up through the Carolinas to Raleigh, and meeting with people, visiting libraries, archives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And along the way, I kept an illustrated journal. Next, please. And this is the drawing I made of the big house at Forest Grove Plantation. Next slide. These are the two ladies that were living there at Forest Grove. That's Lyle Lansdell on the left and her mother Sarah on the right. And they were very gracious to me, and they shared these amazing stories with me. Absolutely amazing. So this is when I met them back in 2007. Their ancestors were the Worthens, and Colonel Thomas, next please, Colonel Thomas Jefferson Worthen of the 28th Georgia was mortally wounded at the Battle of Malvern Hill. Next picture shows his wife, Sarah Wicker Worthen. Now, according to family story, next please, a faithful slave accompanied Colonel Worthen's remains from Virginia to Forest Grove, where they were laid to rest in the family cemetery. Here's his obelisk. This is right across the driveway from the house. Oh, excuse me. Next slide. Here's Sarah's grave, right next to Thomas, Colonel Worthen's. She died in 1891. Next slide. I went back down there in 2013 after my book was published and gave a series of talks down there. And one of them was at the Brown House Museum in Sandersville. And here's my friend Lyle with relics of her ancestor. There's Colonel Worthen's sword, the portraits of him and his wife, his hat. Next slide. Here's the Forest Grove big house as it looks in a photograph. Now, this is a modest home when you compare it to your stereotypical column terra plantations that you see in imagination and in a lot of old literature and movies and stuff. Next slide. But it's a nice house. It's very unusual in that the four doors, each in the front, all open into a room. It's an unusual place. Now, according to family stories, the widow, Sarah Wicker Worthen, several daughters, and about 50 slaves were present at Forest Grove when the Yankees came. A captain told Sarah to evacuate the house. It was going to be burned. We all know Sherman burned everything in his path throughout the South. They were going to burn the house. She refused. With that, the bummers, mostly Germans, according to their family legend, stripped the dining room of its silverware, drenched the carpets with syrup, torched the outbuildings and cotton bales, and forced the slaves to depart with them, leaving small black children clinging to Mrs. Worthen in tears. It's their family story. Now, some items were saved from being destroyed by Sherman's vandals. The late Colonel's sword, which we just saw, was buried in a creek bed and escaped detection. Next slide. This is my friend Lyle, 2013. Next. Her mom, Sarah, since passed away. They got a nice spread down there. They're doing organic farming now. No more slaves. Did have colored help in the kitchen when I went down there, when I met them the first time, though. Next. One of the Worthen girls slipped this teaspoon into her pocket. keeping it safe from the thieving Yankees. The note says, Worthing pan spoon, Julie put it in her pocket, kept the Yankees from taking it. Because, you know, the Yankees would have taken all the silver they can get their hands on. They did it all the time. Next. According to another family story, the faithful slaves loaded the family piano onto a wagon and drove it around back roads until the Yankees left. And so the ancient piano is still preserved. Next slide. When a Yankee picked up this glass dome, which contains artificial flowers and hair art, and he was about to smash it, the Worthing girl that made it begged him not to destroy it, whereupon he gently put it down on the floor. It's been on the Forest Grove mantle ever since. In the stories of these folks, Lyle and her mom, Sarah Lansdell, and in this artifact in particular, I think I came upon the Southern equivalent of my family's stories and artifact. I made many such connections in the South, but few had such a wealth of stories and the artifacts to go along with them as the Lansdells of Forest Grove, Sanderville, Georgia, Washington County, Georgia. Okay, one more adventure to go. Next slide, please. Back to this. Carte de visite of my great-grandfather, Corporal John Longhantz, 154th New York Volunteers. Taken by Bellin Brother of Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. at the end of the war. Must be after the Grand Review, right around there. Next slide. Well, here he is again, my great-grandfather. This is a 6th-plate tintype of my great-grandfather, John Longhantz, and an unidentified friend who I call Bandaged Thumb. My friend Kyle Stetz, who lives down in Virginia, he's a native of Cattaraugus County and collects Cattaraugus County Civil War memorabilia, called me, emailed me, texted me on February 10th, 2016. Mark, there's a tintype of your great-grandfather up for bids on eBay. And I looked, and indeed, that is him. Same clothes. The only difference between this and the CDV is this is sort of a mirror image, so the buttons are on the other side of his coat. Well, obviously I put in a bid, which took the bidding to $45. And then I spent a very nervous week waiting to see what was going to happen as we got closer to hammer time. And having some experience with eBay by this point, I decided to put in a very high bid in the last minute to ensure that I would get this thing, which I proceeded to do. And the bid was so high and so ridiculous, I won't even mention it to you. But you know what? Nobody else bid on it. I got it for $45. Yeah, you're darn right. Oh, man. But the thing is, this comes with a hitch. Who the heck is Bandaged Thumb? My great-grandfather wrote letters from Washington, and he mentions friends of his. He doesn't mention going to be photographed. That doesn't mean he didn't. Obviously he did. But Bandaged Thumb is a mystery to me. He looks a little swarthy. He's wearing a kepi, but what the hell else is this? He looks like a waiter in an Italian restaurant. So it's a real mystery to me. Real mystery. And maybe I'm going to have another adventure one of these days and discover who Bandaged Thumb was and have another story to tell. At which point you can invite me back to speak to you again. So thank you. Those are my adventures. Very adventurous.
Thank you, Mark. Any questions? Oh, light on first. Yes, sir. Anyone have any questions for Mark? We just got to ask him into the... I'll run across the room.
You shared a gentleman named Johnson who had gone in the 1850s and came back to the Isthmus and was in shipwreck. Yeah. Was he on the USS Central America that sank in 57? Or?
No, this occurred earlier than that, and I think they went down off of Point Concepcion. I'm not really sure where that is. And I don't have the name of the ship in memory, but I believe I got it in documentation, and that one doesn't ring a bell. I think it was several years earlier, too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Anyone else?
From Rhode Island?
Yeah, I grew up in Buffalo, and I came to Rhode Island to attend Rhode Island School of Design.
Have you done any of this genealogical work with any of the regiments from Rhode Island?
I'm the founder and current dictator-in-chief of the Rhode Island Civil War Roundtable. No, I really haven't done Rhode Island work aside from little projects here and there. I wrote biographical sketches when we first got the roundtable started about the 6 generals born in Rhode Island. It's a different thing. I'm familiar, of course, with the Rhode Island regiments and batteries to an extent and their histories, but this has been an obsession of mine. I've never really considered until fairly recently moving back to Western New York. Part of it is there's a 4-letter word, starts with an S and ends with a W, that gives you pause when you're thinking of moving back to Buffalo. Nah, I'm strictly 154th New York. After the Hardtack Regiment was published, my second book didn't come out until 18 years later. And what I was doing was I was writing articles. I wanted to tell stories that didn't make it into the Hardtack Regiment. And then the Humiston thing really overtook me. In the meantime, I aborted a couple other book projects. But I knew the Humiston story was fantastic, and I had the great good luck to connect with 2 of his descendants that provided me with the material to write a full-length book and write the definitive book, as you know, Harry Fans and James McPherson have called it. So somewhere along that line, I knew that no other historians that I was aware of was using my method, that is, using a single regiment as the prism through which you could study the entire Civil War. And so I decided to run with it. And then I had the great good luck, after this book, Gettysburg Unknown Soldier, was published by Prager, which is basically a non-affiliated academic press. And then I had the good luck to submit my next book, Brothers One and All, Esprit de Corps in a Civil War Regiment, to LSU Press. And Mike Parrish was and is the editor of their Civil War series. And they went for it. And I did 3 more books with LSU Press. And that makes me very, very proud, because LSU Press is one of the top publishers in the Civil War academic field, and I never took a college history course. I got a friggin' BFA from illustration at RISD, you know. And I've done much more in the Civil War history field than I have in the art field, aside from my mural down in Gettysburg, which is the last serious artwork that I've done. And incidentally, Mark, I got a talk on the Coster Avenue mural, too. Future reference. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it.